The 8 a.m. folks got a 20-minute version of this homily, but something Spanish Mass, we're going to cut that down significantly for you guys. I think one of the most important philosophical works of the 20th century, certainly in moral philosophy, is a book called After Virtue by a philosopher named Alasdair MacIntyre. And he makes a distinction in that book that I have found very helpful in my own thought, my own life, and particularly in understanding this gospel. The distinction is between virtue and law. When you're thinking about a community of people, maybe it's a city, as the philosophers classically talked about, maybe it's a state, maybe it's a nation, maybe it's a family. When you're thinking about a community of people, laws are necessary. We have to order things. We have to make sure that we are acting in a certain way for the preservation of the community. But what MacIntyre said is, laws are not the end-all and be-all of things. That, in fact, virtue, and this was the insight of Aristotle when he wrote his Politics, virtue is the thing that truly motivates and unites a community. So, we as a parish, for example, if I wanted us to pray better together, I could make a rule and say, okay, every single person in our parish has to be part of a small faith-sharing community. Otherwise, you're not allowed to have this ministry or that ministry. You're kind of excluded from parish life in all these different ways. That's a law. It is an order with consequences. But instead, the way to motivate people is virtue. To talk about the virtue of being with our fellow parishioners, being in Christian community, working together for our salvation, laying out this aspirational idea that we are all working toward, saying what the values of a specific community are. And if we all have the same values and we are working toward those same values, then we have greater unity than the punitive issue of law. Because we're more likely to say, yes, together we are oriented toward prayer. Together we are defined by community and working toward our salvation as a community. The problem is that in our society today, in previous societies, in the church, a lot of times we invert these things. We make the laws into the virtues and the virtues into the laws. What do I mean? Best example I can give you is construction housing policy. If you have ever had to build a house or even get a permit from the city for something, you will know all of the different regulations that are in place to build anything. It's one of the reasons we have a housing crisis. It's one of the reasons we can't build new houses very quickly, and when we do, they're massively expensive. There are all of these regulations. All of those regulations have a purpose. As was told to me at summer camp, every rule has a story. Somebody messed up, and then you make a rule about it. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to legislate virtue. What we're trying to say is living spaces should be dignified. They should be a place that people can truly live well and safely. But because we don't trust people to be virtuous, because we can't inspire them to be dignified, because sometimes our base impulses say, well, I can cut corners and make more money, we regulate everything. But the problem is that we're just drowning in regulation, and there is no virtue. And then we get to the point, this is where it gets really inverted, where we say, well, if I follow the law, I am virtuous. That's the standard of my virtue. I am doing the bare minimum, and that means I'm virtuous. But that's not how it is. The purpose of law is to establish minimum standards for a community. If you violate the law, then you have offended the community to such an extent that you have to be removed from the community or you have to be punished until you reconcile. So like a parking ticket, you violated the community by having your car in the wrong place at the wrong time. You have to pay your $75 before you're reconciled back with the community. That's the purpose of a law. If we live our lives, if we live our society, if we live our church, such that we say, well, all I have to do is follow the law, that is not going to be a particularly encouraging community. And we're going to try to continue to make all of these laws that drown us instead of saying, well, this is the virtue. Application to our faith. There are a lot of Catholics, probably because of the way they were catechized and the way we still sometimes fall into catechesis, who judge their faith based on, I'm not sinning. And sometimes it gets worse. Sometimes I talk to Catholics who I offer a confession, and they're like, well, I haven't killed anybody, so it's not that I'm not sinning, it's that I haven't committed that one specific grave sin that we all agree is a grave sin. Right? That's judging our faith based on the minimum standard. The minimum standard of, don't do these things because it's a sin against God or it's a sin against your neighbor. But instead, our faith enjoins us to virtue. We're called to greater things. We're called to charity and to justice. We're called to prudence. We're called to hope. We're called to faith. Instead, what we want to say is what Jesus says. Love God, love neighbor. Those are His commandments. Those are virtues. Those are aspirations. Those are great things that we will never do perfectly this side of heaven, but that are constantly encouraging us to something elevated and transcendent. We're being called to something greater. If we live our faith based on, well, I'm not committing these sins, it's a pretty dark faith. And we have a lot of people, and I feel for them, it's not their fault, who deal with something called scrupulosity. Every day they live obsessing about, am I breaking a commandment? Am I sinning? Am I sinning? Am I sinning? And that's their whole relationship with God. It's just, am I sinning right now? Laws are necessary. Jesus does not get rid of laws. I am not getting rid of laws. I love the laws of the church, and I don't think any of us should be sinning. But what I can tell you is when we live for virtue, when we live for the aspirational, transcendent invitation from God to something greater than ourselves, the sins fall away. We don't have time to sin because we're too busy being saints. If we live our faith obsessing about this is a sin, this is a sin, this is a sin, we don't have any time for virtue. We're not called to higher and greater things, and our life becomes very dark and very oppressed. The inverse can also be true. We can make virtues into laws. A lot of times this will happen, for example, with Catholic devotions. So, somebody might say, man, a couple years ago I started praying the rosary every day, and it changed my life. I feel closer to Mary, I feel closer to Jesus, I have this built-in contemplation every day, I feel connected to a great and deep devotion that has been present in the church for centuries, right? There are all of these wonderful reasons to pray the rosary. And I hope as Catholics we can talk to each other and we can invite each other into these devotions and say, this is a great way to live and I really want you to do this and this would be great and this is what it did for me. Right? That's a beautiful way to live our faith. But it becomes inverted when we have that great experience and then we go to somebody and say, you're not a good Catholic unless you're praying the rosary. There are no laws of the church that require these specific devotions. The church has never said this is a sin against the community such that you need to be punished before you can be reconciled. It's a virtue, and it's a beautiful virtue, and it's something we should invite people into. But it's not something we should condemn them for. It's an invitation, not a condemnation. And this is true for a lot of things. I come to my vocation and a lot of my spirituality through the charismatic movement. And one of the dark sides of the charismatic movement, certain corners of it, they will say, well, unless you're speaking in tongues, you clearly haven't had a relationship with the Holy Spirit. Yikes. Yikes. There is no law that a Christian has to speak in tongues. But there is a dogma that you all receive the Holy Spirit at your baptism. We cannot make the virtue, and in the charismatic movement, the speaking in tongues can be seen as a virtue sometimes, or something that we invite people to that's a transcendent call. We cannot make the virtue into a law. We can't say, oh, let's do this thing, but if you don't, you're a terrible Catholic. All of this is to explain our gospel. The Pharisees have added these devotions onto the law of God. They have all of these extra purifications. There are necessary washings in the law of God in the Old Testament. But what the Pharisees did is they added washings around those washings so that they would be extra careful. It's like saying, well, I don't want to be shocked when I unplug my lamp from the wall. So every time I unplug my lamp, I'm going to shut off the circuit breaker. Right? You build a much bigger circle around the thing you're trying to avoid. That's what the Pharisees were doing, which is fine. Right? From a virtue perspective, the virtue is devotion. It's reverence, something that we called for in our collect today, the opening prayer of Mass. It's a beautiful thing to do. But they have taken that virtue, that aspiration, I want to be particularly pious and aware of the law of God, and they have made it into a law or a condemnation. They've made it into a minimum standard. So they come up to the Lord and they condemn him. And they say, well, your disciples aren't doing these extra things that we do. That means you're a terrible Jew. And Jesus is like, look, man. Well, he doesn't say, look, man, I'm God. He does that in other places in the gospel. But functionally, like, look, guys, you are calling these things, which are the laws of men, these extra things that you've done, the law of God. You have made them into a requirement of God, when in fact they are something that you have added into your own faith. We can't do that as Catholics. The church is a big tent. We invite a lot of people in, all of us sinners. Catholicism has a lot of expressions of the faith. There are minimum standards. There are minimum things that we have to do to be good Catholics. The Church lays those out in the Catechism. The Church lays those out in the Code of Canon Law. There are certain things that are required of all Catholics. But above that foundation is this beautiful life of virtue and aspiration and transcendence. And calling each other to that is a beautiful way to live the faith, but always as an invitation and a joy, never as a condemnation. We don't want to be more Catholic than the Church. We don't want to put obligations on our fellow Catholics that the Church herself does not oblige them to. A final challenge. Think about your family and friends. And think about the way you invite them into discipline, virtue, and faith. At the 8 a.m. Mass, I use this example, and it's fine. I'll use it again. I don't like to pick on teenagers. They're going through a lot. I think we should have a lot of mercy and compassion for our teenagers. But man, they make good analogies for homilies. So, imagine a teenager. My sister did this when she was a teenager. Her chore was to wash the dishes at the end of the night, right? Whatever is in the kitchen, she needed to clean. Okay. So she would grumble and cross her arms and roll her eyes and put it off, and my mom would have to remind her, and she would yell and whatever else, right? Typical teenager stuff. That's what she did. There are two ways you can approach that. You can approach it from the law perspective, and it's not wrong for parents to enforce laws on their children. That's a necessary thing, right? There's a community standard that has to be upheld, and if the child is going against the needs of the family, that law needs to be enforced. You can condemn the child. You can say, this is terrible, you're terrible, you have all this attitude, whatever, right? Parents get frustrated, they say these things. That's the law approach. But, from our humanity, it's more appealing to take the virtue approach. Have a conversation about, look, this family is a team, we are a unit. The only way that we will survive, the only way we will thrive and find this to be a fulfilling experience as a family is if we're all on the same page. Can we get on the same page together? Can we work together? Can we find a way to aspire toward the same goal together? Kids don't always respond to that, but because they're human, humans generally respond to that better than the alternative. The same is true for faith. If we invite somebody into Catholicism, let's preach the gospel of joy, of transcendence, of reverence and beauty and salvation and peace and fulfillment. Talk about the virtues of self-sacrifice, the virtues of devotion and reverence, the virtues of service and care. Focus on that. We should not sin. We need to respect the laws of the Church. But I can promise you, if we live a life of virtue and salvation, where we remember love God and love neighbor, and we aspire to that, the laws will take care of themselves.